This case led Mr. Black down a long unexpected path of darkness. The initial objective of the video was thrown off course mid-production by his discoveries, but it will link back up in part 2. It's important to watch this video in full and keep your eyes open. Even if you think you know this case, prepare yourself for shock.
See, this is your life. You're gonna fight for your family. You want to stay in this family or not? What do you want to do? You want to give up? You want to whine and moan? Well, what is it? Yes or no?
Protect me from you, my
Say it like you mean it.
It's getting later and it's harder to leave. I'm trying to heal. I'm trying to make.
I forgot. I don't know.
Someone please come to my defense.
How many times do you think I want to tell you to look in my eyes?
Someone please come to my defense.
Rochelle Neve was 3 when she and her siblings were heavily abused by their mother. She was also 3 when her 6-year-old brother Ricky was murdered by a teenager from the local area. These are traumatic enough experiences for anyone to be put through. Awful things that one might assume are best experienced while young enough to forget they ever even happened. But is not remembering really the same thing as never happening? And do children actually remember much from the age of 3 and under? Well, ask yourself, what do you remember from when you were 3 years old? Mostly happy memories? Mostly traumatic experiences? Do you remember anything? Recently, the question was raised about the legitimacy of an adult's testimony according to their early childhood memories. And by early, I mean within the first few years of life. Let's say birth to 3 years old. You see, I wonder how much memory can be recalled during this time period, later on in a kid's grown-up life. This is something I truly seek to understand better. But just how early childhood experiences begin to define us as adults is really what piques my interest. In the late 1980s, clinical psychologist Dr. Ken McGidd, who specializes in dealing with heavily abused children, videotaped a therapy session with a 6-year-old girl named Beth Thomas. You may have heard about her in YouTube videos often titled "Psychopathic Evil Little Girl" or something of that nature. Beth had been so badly abused within the first 19 months of her life that she couldn't bond with others. She was also unable to give or receive love, let alone display any trace of a conscience. It seemed like the little girl had absolutely no remorse for any of her actions. She and her little brother were adopted by a Methodist minister named Tim Tennant and his wife Julie Tennant. The couple were unable to have kids of their own, so in February of 1984, they decided to adopt Beth and her brother John from social services. Beth was roughly a year and a half, while John was around 7 months old. Tim and Julie were both led to believe that the kids they were adopting were 2 healthy and mentally sound children. The Tennants just wanted to share the love they had to offer with someone. They felt like they wanted to raise kids that they could pass everything on to when they pass away. So when they got the call about Beth and John, it was a dream come true, and one that came quicker than expected. People can wait up to 10 years to adopt a child, yet miraculously, they were being offered 2 while seemingly getting to skip the queue. But just months into the adoption, Tim and Julie's dreams were swiftly shattered as soon as it became apparent that 19-month-old Beth and her little brother John were not normal kids. They had serious problems their new parents weren't aware of, problems specifically affecting the behavior of Beth. As the Tennants began to ask questions as to the origins of Beth's actions, they made a startling discovery. Beth and John's early life greeted them with nothing but suffering. Their mom had a kidney disease and was constantly in the hospital. She would end up dying when Beth was about 1, leaving the children in the exclusive care of their biological father. It seems clear to me that the abuse started before this tragic event, but I think it seriously ramped up its intensity after Beth lost her mother. When social services stepped into the picture, allegedly following a report by a doctor, the neglect and abuse they discovered was haunting.
He's an intelligent child and a very attractive one. But Philippe is a problem. At school, at home, to himself. Philippe is an overly aggressive child. What can be done? We can say, oh, this is just a phase, he'll outgrow it. Or we can recognize that he needs help and that something can be done to help him.
John was found in a bassinet, covered in urine and feces. His diaper hadn't been changed in days. There was a bottle at his feet that contained curdled milk. The back of 7-month-old John's head was flat and oddly shaped due to him never being lifted or moved. The front of his head had become bulged. The poor boy couldn't raise his head, let alone roll over on his own. Tim described John as a child who simply had no stimulation whatsoever. But Beth's behavior in Tim and Julie's house was the catalyst to discovering what was really happening to John. Beth's disturbing actions seemingly began when she started targeting pets and other animals she came into contact with. According to her, she had 4 domesticated animals at the time: Clyde, Shuggy, Darcy, and a dog named Annie. 6-year-old Beth openly discusses with Dr. Majid just what she does to the animals in her company when no one's looking.
Do you have animals, Beth?
4 of them.
And what do you do to the animals, Beth?
Stick them with pins.
Do you stick them a little bit or a lot?
A lot.
What are you trying to do to the animals, Beth?
Kill them.
What do they do when you stick them with the pins?
Well, Annie cries. She's a dog.
She got baby birds down out of the nest, and we thought maybe she was just curious. So we explained that she could hurt them, put them back, and went through a whole sitting down and talking to her about the problem of it. And the next day we went out to check the baby birds, and they were on the ground dead with their necks broken.
Let's talk about what happened once when you were smaller, when you found some baby birds in a tree. What did you do then?
I took them out.
Mm-hmm. And what did Mom say to you?
That the mother will not come back if somebody touches her babies.
Mm-hmm. Are the baby birds kind of small? Can you describe them for me?
Well, they don't have their eyes open, but they can hear me, and they look up.
Are they kind of helpless? Little baby birds? Can they fly?
No.
Can they run away?
Yes.
They can? Are they easy to catch or hard to catch?
Hard.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to remember. With the baby birds, what did you do?
Took them out of the tree.
And what did you do with them?
Played around too rough. Also, when at the end, I picked it up and I thought it was Dad, and I came to say, Mommy, is this bird dead? And she said, she called Daddy and said, Tim, and Daddy came and, I think I remember that they said yes.
Mm-hmm. And so did the little baby birds die?
I don't know.
You don't remember?
I just remember that I remember that Mommy and Daddy saying the last bird we got was dead.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what Mom said to me? She said that all of them were dead. Did you squeeze them? Did Baby Beth squeeze them? You're doing a good job, honey. Go ahead and tell me what happened.
I squeezed them.
And what happened?
They died.
It's chilling to see a 6-year-old go from pure forgetful denial to complete admission of guilt without so much as a second thought. Beth's attempts to mislead Dr. Magid are poorly invested in. It's like the very second she realizes he's not buying it, she completely confesses to avoid the hassle of manipulation. A new disturbing bar was set when the little girl started exhibiting uncontrollable urges to masturbate. If Tim and Julie weren't fully aware that Beth had severe psychological problems before, they certainly were when they discovered her sexual promiscuity. Behavior, it appeared, that linked back to a recurring nightmare Beth had frequently. Only her looping dream of terror was based on true events caused by her birth father.
The nightmare was about a man who was falling on her and hurting her with a part of himself.
She started to masturbate at inappropriate times. I remember one time when we were at the hospital waiting for Tim to come out. He was there visiting, and Beth and John were in the back seat, and I turned around and she had her legs spread and was masturbating in a public parking lot. And I had tried to explain to her numerous times before that that's private area. You don't do it in public places. And gone over that with her, and it never seemed to faze her. And
Julie, how often would your daughter masturbate?
Daily. Constantly.
Have you ever rubbed your private parts?
Mm-hmm.
Do you do it a lot?
A lot.
How much do you do that?
Not every single day, and that's into... I did it every single day until it got real bad and messed up, and I had to go to the doctor, and I did not like it.
What do you mean by real bad?
Well, it looked real raw, got all kinds of boo-boos on it, germs, a lot of stuff from my hand.
And it bled?
Mm-hmm.
But herself and animals are not the only thing that Beth took her rage out on. She not only desired to cause the deaths of Tim and Julie, but she desperately wanted to kill her little brother Jonathan. It shakes my soul to hear this poor 6-year-old, loveless little human describe these awful and undeserving things with such emotionless detail. She was only 19 months old when it stopped. 1 year and 7 months. There was no one to love her, and she never saw anyone be loved. To 6-year-old Beth Thomas, love simply didn't exist. And in place of love, she was forced to experience this.
Tell me about your birth father. What was that nightmare like?
When he touched my vaginas
Okay.
until it bled, hurt it a lot until it bled, and wouldn't feed me a lot. He'd hit on me, wouldn't be very nice to me.
How old were you?
1.
And in your nightmare, what happens?
I get real scared.
Where are you in the nightmare? What happens in the dream?
I'm in the house, upstairs.
And then what happens, Beth?
When he comes upstairs and, hurt.
How do you feel when you talk about this?
Scared.
Beth is recalling trauma from the age of 1. This trauma has completely infected and consumed her life, as you're about to see, and she absolutely remembers some of it. You may say, but Mr. Black, maybe someone told Beth her history. Well, I don't doubt that as a possibility that's probable, but when they show her childhood drawings on the screen, I think it becomes all the more evident that Beth Thomas is definitely recalling her past.
Where's your birth father? What's he doing?
He's right there, and there's his hand. His hand's right there.
Where?
Right there. You can't hardly see it because it's green.
What's it touching?
My vaginas.
And what is your birth father doing?
Hurting it.
Your face looks sad. Can you tell me about that?
It's crying because those dots are the tears.
When Jonathan started waking up screaming in tears at night, complaining about his stomach, the tenants couldn't figure out why their adopted son was in such pain. But quickly, the cause of his agony was discovered. John wasn't sick, and he wasn't having nightmares. He was literally being attacked in his sleep.
But this kind of aggression at our animals and even at our brother Jonathan was beginning to grow to such an excess that our life was miserable at home. John would cry in the mornings and say his stomach hurt. For the longest time, we thought maybe this child has some problem with his intestinal area, or maybe he has allergies, and so we tried to get all that checked out. Come to find out, Beth was coming out of her room and hitting him in the stomach. And so as a last resort, just to protect him, we had to tie our door shut. So I guess for the last 3 or 4 months now, we've had to tie her in at night.
Are people afraid of you, Beth?
Uh-huh.
Who's afraid of you, Beth?
John.
Your brother. And why is your brother afraid of you?
Because I hurt him so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And at nighttime, what do your parents do to your door?
Lock it shut.
Why do they lock it shut?
Because they don't want me to hurt John.
Right. And they're kind of afraid of hurting John? Of you hurting John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are they afraid that you might hurt them?
Yep.
Would you, Beth?
Mm-hmm.
When would you do it?
Nighttime.
Okay. Why would you do nighttime?
Because I don't like them seeing me do it. But they can feel me do it.
Mm-hmm. And what would you do to him, Beth?
Stab him.
Okay. What would you stab him with?
A knife.
Do you ever stick pins in people?
Mm-hmm.
Who?
My brother.
Okay. Do you do it a little bit or a lot?
A lot.
Okay. And what are you trying to do to your brother?
Kill him.
Why do you want your brother to die?
Because I was hurt so bad, and I don't want to be around people.
Okay. Who else would you like to stick pins into?
Mommy and Daddy.
What would you like to have happen to them?
Die.
Does your brother have private parts?
Yeah.
Yeah? What is his private parts?
Penis and butt.
Mm-hmm. And what do you do with your brother with his private parts, Beth?
I heard it.
Tell me about it. What do you do?
Well, I pinch it. Squeeze it. Kick it.
When you do things to your brother's private parts, what does he say?
Stop.
Okay, tell me that.
Well, he says stop, but I don't stop.
Do you hurt him?
Mm-hmm. A lot.
Okay. And would you like to do that to other boys?
When I caught her with Jonathan one morning, she was molesting him. He was crying and his pants were down, and I said, Beth, what's happening? And she said, I pulled his penis and put my finger up his anus. And I said, didn't he say to stop? And she said, yeah, he did. And I said, did you? And she said, no.
She had tried to kill John on several occasions and openly admitted that.
In the basement, she was hitting his head against a cement floor. I heard his screams and ran down and had to literally pull her hands off, and she looked wild-eyed.
Did you get real mad at him? Did you hit his head real hard? Tell me about it. How many times did you do it? A lot? What was the floor like?
Cement.
And what happened to your brother? Tell me about it.
His head hurt real bad. But his chin, he had to have stitches in it.
Could you stop? Use your words, Beth.
No.
Okay. What was your brother doing when you were doing this?
Playing with the toys.
Okay. Was he asking you to stop when you were doing it? What was he saying?
He was saying, Beth, stop.
And what did you do?
I didn't stop. I just kept on hurting him.
What were you thinking when you were doing that?
Thinking of killing him.
How did you stop? What made you stop?
When I heard Peter walking across the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
It made me stop because I thought Mommy and Daddy were coming.
Okay. Did Mommy come? What did she do?
She sent me to my room.
Okay.
It might be nothing, just a stumble, but I swear that in that moment, you can hear it in his voice when Dr. Magid becomes overwhelmed by Beth's story.
And what if Mom didn't stop you? What would you have done?
Kept on doing it.
This is what zero love looks like when it's worn by a child that's been abused. From birth to 5 years old, a child's brain develops more then than any other time in their lives. It seems likely that Beth's trauma may have left her with psychopathy. I mean, it seems pretty clear, right? It's hard not to characterize Beth's behaviors as psycho. And one of the likely risk factors of becoming psychopathic is early exposure to a dysfunctional environment. According to verywellfamily.com,
children who have been physically abused, neglected, and separated from their parents are more likely to develop psychopathy. Poor bonding with a parent is also thought to be a factor.
the study relied on callous unemotional, or the CU scale, to rate a child's behavior. The children used in the study were all between the ages of 2 and 4 years old, and the scale was based on 5 simple statements. Number 1, your child doesn't seem guilty after misbehaving. Number 2, punishment doesn't change your child's behavior. Number 3, your child is selfish or won't share. Number 4, your child lies. Number 5, your child is sneaky and tries to get around you. Later on in life, when the kids from the study were 9, they were tested again and discovered that the children who rated poorly on the CU scale were the ones who were most likely to later show signs linking them to psychopathy. It's important to remember that there is no real psychopath test for kids, only tools for assessment or measuring. Another quote from verywellfamily.com says,
Poor bonding with a parent is also thought to be a factor. A parent with mental health issues or substance abuse problems, or one with little contact with an infant, for example, may never bond with a child. Children who have inconsistent caregivers may also be unable to successfully attach to an adult.
Hell, even breastfeeding is touted to help reduce the risk of unwanted antisocial behaviors in a child. With all these things taken into consideration, it's no wonder Beth acted the way she did. It was the only thing she'd ever learned. She was clearly exhibiting psychopathic behavior, but Beth was not a psychopath. Beth was experiencing something that we'll talk about in a bit. People often think that the opposite of love is hate. But I think rage is a pretty good contender as an opposing emotional force. It's a fellow 4-letter word that typically carries the same red-shaded intensity that love does. Beth Thomas was filled with rage, and it seemed like her predatory nature was turning into some kind of twisted game in her mind. But when knives went missing from Tim and Julie's kitchen, the family realized that Beth was truly capable of evil.
Well, I noticed several like paring knives in the kitchen missing. And my first thought was Beth. And I felt a little guilty about it at first. I thought, nah. But I really didn't even mention it to her. They had been gone several weeks. She was sitting at the table drawing and mentioned to me "What do those knives look like that are gone, Mom?" And I said, "What knives, Beth?" And she said, "Weren't they kind of silver and about this big?" And I knew then, and then this little smile that's not a sweet smile, but a malicious type of smile. And I knew then, I thought, she's got them.
Tell me about the knives. Where did you get them?
From the drawer.
And where else? Do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about it.
I got them from the dishwasher.
What kind of knives?
Big sharp ones.
And what do you want to do with those knives?
Kill John and Mommy with them, and Daddy.
And when Mommy asks you about where the knives are, what do you say?
I don't know where they are.
In April of 1989, Beth was moved to a place that was designed to help children with attachment disorders. Children like Beth. But this would be no easy road to recovery. The children in this home are a danger to themselves and society. If these kids don't get the help they need, the chances of them hurting or killing someone is extremely high. Nancy Thomas explains this in a chilling way.
I have children that have killed numerous times. Cold-blooded family members, neighbor children killed them. And they can do it. Makes my blood run cold just thinking about 9 years old. People don't think a 9-year-old is capable of cold-blooded murder, but they are. That attachment break does severe damage to the heart, the ability to care and the ability to love. If they don't care and they don't love, they're capable of anything.
So what condition did Beth have? She's not a psychopath, and she isn't considered evil. So what exactly is wrong with this 6-year-old? Well, Beth Thomas has something called reactive attachment disorder, or RAD, which in short is a collection of symptoms or behaviors rooted in a child that has often been passed around from home to home, where they missed out on affection by way of a primary caregiver. Abuse and neglect are also prime catalysts for RAD. Beth Thomas had experienced all of the above. So how do you fix a child with reactive attachment disorder? Well, Nancy Thomas explains how.
We're very strict about everything. Everything is completely monitored. We take complete control because a child who's unattached does not trust. And because they don't trust, they don't allow anybody to be boss of them. So we take complete control. They are not boss of anything. They have to ask to get a drink of water. They have to ask to go to the bathroom. They have to ask to leave our sight. Part of that is because we cannot trust them because of the damage that they've done before.
Beth, would you like to say grace, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this good day and everybody doing good. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. They believe that they're evil. They believe they're from the devil. They believe that they are not a person of value. And we have to change that, and we have to build that from a child who's nothing, who's a bad kid in their own mind, to a child who's valuable and loving, and they see themselves as that.
You don't have to bite this.
When they do a chore well, we can say, you did a good job, you're a good worker. And then it just builds that self-esteem little by little so that they change the way that they see themselves.
Several months into treatment in this controlled environment, Beth had made progress, and her therapist decided to loosen some of the controls.
Anybody wants some more? I've seen that.
Beth continued to show signs of improvement. She began to develop a sense of right and wrong. She seemed to respond to affection, was more outgoing.
Gosh, you don't have to like
She went to public school, made friends at the local church, and even sang in the choir.
And you're going to go into Sunday school again this morning?
Yeah.
Get sticker. In the beginning, we couldn't trust her with anything. She was locked up at night. We had alarms on the door at night, so she wasn't sneaking around doing things with the other children. We don't worry about that anymore. There's no alarm on her door at night now. She sleeps in the same room with my own daughter, and I trust her that much. She brushes the dogs, and I trust her that much. because she has earned that trust. She's learned it. She has a heart, and she has a love inside, and she feels bad when she does something now. In the past, because she didn't have a conscience, she didn't feel anything when she did something bad. There was just no feeling there. And now she does feel bad, and it shows in her face. I believe that Beth can make it. She's got a really bright mind. She's got a good heart now, which has done a lot of healing. She's got a really super set of parents. They're powerful, they're knowledgeable, they're motivated. She's done a lot of good work with you in therapy, with Cannell and with myself. She wants to heal, and that's the number one key. And she wants to heal because she has a family that really cares about her, and she wants to be with them.
Do you know where that anger came from?
That's when my birth dad hurt me. I had it all inside, and I remembered it, and I started doing it.
And what did that do when it was inside?
It made me want to hurt people really bad.
And who did you hurt?
My brother, my mom and dad, and animals. And animals.
Who did it hurt the most?
My brother.
Who did it hurt the
Me.
most?
Why don't you tell me that?
It hurt me the most.
How did it hurt you the most?
Because when I hurt other people, I'm burning my good self.
How do you feel right now, Beth?
Sad.
It's kind of tough to talk about, isn't it?
Yes.
It is.
The last time Beth was interviewed for the documentary was in 1989. And while the documentary ended there, this is by no means the end of the story. For a long time, no one had really heard anything else from Beth, and Child of Rage was all anyone had to go on. Then in 2010, the publisher, Families by Design, released a book called Dandelion on My Pillow, Butcher Knife Beneath. It was written by Nancy, Tarina, and Beth Thomas. It features Beth's autobiography, which she wrote when she was 19, among stories of other disturbed children with attachment disorders. If you'd like to get Beth's book, you can find the link in the description of this video. After releasing the book, Beth disappeared from the internet, and as far as I can see, it would be 5 years before anyone would hear from Beth again. Then in 2015, during an interview on BBS Radio, a 32-year-old Beth Thomas was heard live online for what appears to be the first time in 30 years. During this interview, we find out that Beth and John were not the only children in the abusive household she was born into.
So what I was diagnosed with was reactive attachment disorder. And what reactive attachment disorder is, so it occurs in the first 3 years of life. And usually with the causes, they range from abuse, neglect, trauma, separation and loss, in utero trauma, such as drugs and alcohol abuse, ongoing pain, such as if a child is separated like from their family in that first few years of life and have to be hospitalized for an extended period of time, repeated moves, such as foster care and being placed into different homes. And with me, what occurred is I was born into a very abusive home and environment. And then my birth mother died when I was 18 months old of kidney disease. So during that time, she was gone so much, going into the hospital and dialysis. And at that time, I had 6 other siblings. And then shortly after I was born, about a year after I was born, my little brother was born. So there were quite a few children in this home. And it was a very abusive environment, sadly, from my birth father. And then my birth mother died. So therefore, I had that separation and loss, the abuse, that neglect. And then what happened is it all kind of comes to, there's that first year cycle of life that when a child has a need, when a baby has a need, they cry, they and that cry, if it's not taken care of right away, becomes rage because they're so helpless and hopeless because they cannot care for themselves. And so therefore, when that need is met and they get adequate gratification, then they learn to trust that caregiver, that provider, and establish a bond. And what happened is when I would have that need, that gratification didn't come, and therefore that trust was not established. And just to kind of talk about the symptoms of attachment disorder, it's important that, when a child is being diagnosed with attachment disorder, obviously that there's a clinician on board that is familiar with it for sure. But they usually they say, the symptoms, they should have at least half or more of those symptoms. One of the biggest symptoms is superficially engaging and charming. They are one person at home with their family, and they are someone completely different with someone else if they recognize that they can con and manipulate that person that maybe has just walked into the room or their life. They could be seething anger, rage, and pain at their mom because that pain is directed towards the maternal being, and they can turn it off and turn it back on in a heartbeat. Because they attachment disorder, it's an inability to give and receive affection, and they are indiscriminately affectionate. They have extreme control problems. I had extreme control problems, extremely sneaky, destructive to self and others. I was very abusive to my younger brother. We were adopted together, and I very quickly, at 18 months, was already acting out on him and on my adoptive family at the time. Cruelty to animals is another one that's big on that. There are no impulse controls, chronic crazy lying, lack of conscience is huge on that. Persistent nonsense questions and chatter because they're trying to control the situation, they don't feel safe in the environment because the last environment they might have been in was an abusive and scary one. So they set their control. They control the situation so as to feel safe, that no one can hurt them again because they've already been hurt when they let their guard down. So there's a lot that's in regards to attachment disorder and how it obviously was reflected in me, and then how it affects who I am now. And what I do is after I healed from attachment disorder and going through intensive therapy to heal from that, I teach now about attachment disorder and how it was manifested in my life, and how I healed and how others can heal too. And my goal is that there is hope provided in that. I became a nurse and I work in the neonatal ICU, and I'm also a neonatal flight nurse. And my goal with that is to try to break that cycle that so many can get caught up in, that teenage mom that comes in that has been in a life of abuse and then has this child, and to be able to help her recognize that she doesn't have to repeat that cycle that maybe she came from, that she can actually learn to connect and bond with her little child, with her baby, with whether it's premature or term, that she can actually learn to connect and rebuild that broken bond. The biggest thing is that, yes, I was younger when I went through my healing process, and I do feel like that somewhat helped because I was a little bit younger. But as my mom always says, if you're breathing, there's hope. As an adult, someone that would be dealing with attachment disorder, in order for them to heal, the biggest thing is they have to recognize that there's even a problem, and then recognize that they want to heal. That, I think, is very difficult for many adults to do, to accept that there is a problem, and that's not something that is easy to be done. when I healed, and I went through through therapy during, intensive therapy during 6 to 8 years old, there was a time that I started to heal, and I could recognize that change, recognize that I had empathy and that I didn't want to disappoint. The documentary Child of Rage, it's interesting. You can see in the beginning, if you listen and you watch it, you notice that there's no feeling or emotion behind some of the terrible things that I am saying. That's hallmark, that there was no empathy there. But as I heal, as Child of Rage shows the healing process, then you start to see me as I have that empathy, as I start to recognize the pain that I had caused. And that was a big part in turning the corner. When I was a little bit older, after that healing process, I was actually placed in a group home and a foster home for an amount of time. And while I was in the group home, there were times that I could be selfish or manipulative. But as I was able to get back into my family that helped me to heal, then I was able to feel safe and like I didn't have to be in control. And because I was placed back into my mom's home and had that consistency, I could relinquish that control because I was able to move forward. When I was 15, I did have some memories that came up in regards to abuse that had occurred to me, as well as reprocessing my childhood, but at a teenage level. And it was very difficult for me. And I became depressed, and I had some traumatic memories arise when I also started to date and realized that something was not right. And so I actually did EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, because it's very good with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was extremely helpful at that time in my life to help me kind of move past that. I think my teaching and watching Child of Rage, as often as I end up having to watch it because I show it before I teach, in its way has become very healing for me. The first time I ever spoke in front of an audience, I was 16 and I was terrified. I was completely terrified to get up and just air everything and have no skeletons in the closet and completely be open and honest about who I was, how far I'd come, how hard I'd worked, and the pain and trauma that I had caused to family in my life and to my little brother. And I remember there was a family member, a mom, that came up to me after I spoke. And she said that my getting up there and sharing that story gave her hope that her child who had attachment disorder could someday heal. And that was eye-opening for me.
There's a dramatized, made-for-TV type of movie that's based on Beth's early life. It's also called Child of Rage, but it's not to be confused with the documentary that actually features Beth herself. The film does a great job of depicting the struggles a family goes through when caring for a child with RAD. It's worth a watch, but in Beth's own words, parts of the movie have been quite Hollywoodized, and some things just weren't accurate at all. But even with the film's inconsistencies, Beth further states that its intentions were essential to showcasing the kind of trauma she went through. One big question I found myself asking while researching this story and learning about RAD was, could attachment disorders have anything to do with the widespread violence we see in the world today? Well, Beth was actually asked this very same question during the 2015 radio interview.
That inability to give and receive affection, that inability to have empathy, that lack of conscience. I mean, some people, Ted Bundy, for example, had attachment disorder. If you go back and you look at his past and his childhood, he definitely has multiple causes and multiple signs and symptoms. Adolf Hitler was another one that definitely had attachment disorder. You look back at his Saddam Hussein. Helen Keller, actually, you look back at her history and her past and how her, physical disability also somewhat exacerbated that, because there was an inability to help rebuild that connection. And that was very difficult. And now she is one of our greatest humanitarians, thankfully, because of that person, by Anne Sullivan coming into her life and being able to provide that consistency and helping to rebuild that broken bond that had been established. But I do feel like that it's very important to recognize that someone that can go out and hurt somebody and have no remorse at all for what they're doing, that obviously is an individual that has been broken and does not know how to love and have empathy. And I do feel like we have a lot of that in our society, and you see that across the world. And as what's going on in Baltimore right now, it's devastating to me to see a world that has such potential for love to have such potential for hate too. It's heartbreaking to me.
Beth Thomas was 32 in 2015 when she did the interview. And while listening, I did pick up on something. There was a caller on the show that asked Beth a question, and throughout the whole show, there was only ever one caller. The woman that called in was introduced as Cindy initially, but she corrected the interviewer by claiming she was Nancy from Colorado. I think this would fly by most people, but because my mother's name is also Nancy, and I know Nancy Thomas is Beth's adopted mother, I began to wonder, was Nancy from Colorado actually Nancy Thomas? When I compare the voice of Beth's second adopted mom from the documentary to the caller, it feels like I discovered an Easter egg. I believe the caller is Nancy Thomas. And when I checked Nancy's mental health service Facebook page, it also lists her as in Colorado. Nancy Thomas has a center designed to help kids like Beth recover. If the caller is Beth's adopted mom, Nancy, why the charades? Why the act?
Let's take a caller. We have a caller in Beth. This caller is Cindy calling in from Colorado. Cindy, are you there?
Hi, yeah, this is Nancy from Colorado.
Nancy. Go ahead, Nancy.
Hi, I was just wondering what Beth would recommend that parents do to help their child when they have RAD.
I feel like it's very important that a family that has a child with reactive attachment disorder, that they definitely find someone, a therapist specifically, that specializes in attachment disorder to work with their family and with their child. And that they actually provide that consistency in their home and in consistency in school, that they help that child to have that external control so that therefore they can learn to have internal control. But it's very important that they definitely get the help that they need from someone who is an expert in attachment disorder.
Well, if they got their heart broken from not enough love, can the parents just love them and then they'll get better?
Definitely not. Sadly, love is not enough for a child with attachment disorder. I was definitely loved till as much love as possible could have been given to me. And that was something that sadly did not do the trick. Until I was able to have that empathy and be able to connect myself, there was no way to have that reciprocation.
So you couldn't take in the love even though your mom loved you a lot?
Correct.
The entire 2015 interview with Beth is about an hour long. She goes on to say that what she went through is what allows her to remind others struggling with attachment disorders that there is hope. I'll link to its upload down below for those who are interested in hearing the whole thing. Whatever happened to Beth Thomas's little brother Jonathan is seemingly unknown. I found very little credible mention of him online. I can only hope that he found peace and recovery in this life. I can't imagine how going through what he went through affected him. The focus has always been on Beth's well-being, but we should remember that this is Jonathan's story too. He was a victim of his father and his sister, and God knows what the other kids in the house were like. There are some theories about John that I'd like to go over. I read several people claiming John was in prison in North Carolina for child trafficking, but I did some digging. They're referring to Jonathan Lynn Max Jenkins. I don't think this is Beth's brother. After all, John Jenkins is black. I've also heard people say John died of a heart attack. Well, I checked that out too. It seems they're referring to Jonathan Scott Thomas. He was, according to reports, a sports ref in Michigan. And to be fair, one look at his picture would make you do a double take. He does look like Beth Thomas's brother from the pictures all grown up. But he was born in 1988, so it couldn't be him. Coincidentally though, his mother's name is Lori Beth Thomas. But again, that's just a coincidence. Nothing more. People have even gone as far as to claim that the home improvement actor Jonathan Taylor Thomas is Beth's brother. I can solve that one quickly for you too. Born in 1980. These are not the Johns we're looking for. John, if you're listening, myself and my whole channel wish you the very best. Reach out if you ever feel so inclined to tell your story. There is healing in both telling and hearing. This picture was also used on a few sites claiming that it's Beth's biological parents. I mean, it's obviously not, just look at the style, but I can also tell you exactly who's in this photo. Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson, with their daughter, Madison. They disappeared in 2009 near Red Oak, Oklahoma. Their remains were found in 2013. No cause of death or reason for their disappearance has ever been revealed. I'm not going to dive into this case right now, but I'd be curious to know if there are any ties to this case and serial killer Israel Keys. After all, I read he had connections in Oklahoma. He was only caught in 2012, and there was that one drawing he made that said, "We are one." Anyway, that's another episode. But again, that's not the end of the Beth Thomas story. There's another part to the darkness surrounding Beth's life, somewhat directly and somewhat indirectly. Sometime after young Beth's interview, she ended up being treated by a social worker named Connell Watkins, or Connell. I don't know. I don't care. To my knowledge, Beth never experienced anything negative in the hands of Watkins, but someone else did.
I do come in support of H. Con Res 435, the Candace Newmaker Resolution of 2002. I introduced this resolution in July to honor a little girl from North Carolina who lost her life tragically because of voodoo science called rebirthing. She was a beautiful 10-year-old girl, her whole life ahead of her, and she died tragically in April of 2000 because she was forced to take part in a rebirthing therapy session. Candace had been adopted out of the foster care system by a single woman, and like any child would, she missed her parents and her siblings, and her adoptive mother claimed that she and Candace were not bonding properly. Well, while searching the internet for help, Candace's adoptive mother discovered reactive attachment therapy. It's a disorder treatment, a clinical term for what folks see as a child's ability to bond with new adoptive parents. A therapist who never even met Candace diagnosed her with the disorder, and her mother took her to Colorado for treatment. A radical attachment disorder therapist was paid $7,000 for a 2-week course of treatment for Candace. This was not a licensed psychiatrist or a licensed psychologist. The supposed therapist's highest degree was a master's in social work. After a few days of other attachment therapy, the therapist thought that Candace was ready for the rebirthing therapy. This was supposed to simulate Candace's trip through the birth canal and would symbolically deliver her to her adoptive mother and erase her natural birth 10 years ago. The therapist and her assistant, along with 2 other helpers, wrapped Candace tightly in a flannel blanket and covered her with 8 cushions. Then the 4 adults put their combined weight of 673 pounds on Candace's 70-pound body, bounced on her and squeezed her to simulate contractions. During the 70-minute procedure, the adults taunted Candace to try to fight her way out of the cocoon. 10 minutes into the procedure, Candace begged to be let out because she could not breathe. Her sobs and her pleas were ignored, and she was even told to go ahead and die by the therapist. Candace continued to cry for her life for 30 more minutes. 40 minutes into the procedure, she spoke her last word, "No." The adults continued to sit on her and taunt her for 30 more minutes. When they finally unwrapped Candace, she was dead. Her adoptive mother had witnessed the entire episode, and the therapist had even videotaped the procedure, which was used against her in a court of law. She and her assistant were convicted of reckless child abuse resulting in death and were sentenced to 16 years each. Colorado has since passed a law to outlaw this horrendous practice, and other states, including my state of North Carolina, will hopefully do so soon. The resolution I introduced, H. Con. Res. 435, would express the sense of Congress that this rebirthing therapy is dangerous and should be prohibited. This therapeutic technique is not recognized by any professional psychological groups, and many have specifically denounced the practice, including the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Judge David Bazelon Center for Mental Health, and the National Council for Adoption. And I encourage all states to outlaw this voodoo science and prevent another tragedy from happening. Candace's grandparents, David and Mary Davis, who are my constituents and who are here today, have been tireless advocates for outlawing this procedure. They don't want their granddaughter to have died in vain. I ask my colleagues to join me in passing this resolution to ensure states to outlaw this procedure.
Connell Watkins and her death crew were tried and convicted of reckless child abuse resulting in death. They were sentenced to 16 years in prison, but Connell would only serve 7. Candace's law was signed in 2001 after the incident, banning all rebirthing therapy in the state of Colorado. Rest in peace, Candace Newmaker. Beth seemingly resides in Colorado with her family and appears to be doing quite well in life, even winning Nurse of the Year a while back. Her and Nancy Thomas both run an organization called Families by Design, where they claim to help parents and kids deal with struggles like the ones they faced. They truly do what appears on the surface to be good work for the world, and they seem to have a thirst for saving children and families that are struggling. I certainly hope that's the case. My only issue is that Watkins is never allowed to work with children again. And Nancy Thomas was a part of Connell Watkins and Associates at the time Candace was killed. But apart from previously being a dog trainer, I haven't seen any other qualifications listed for Nancy Thomas, though she does claim to have trained or worked with Neil Feinberg. But that's not very settling either. Apparently, his mentor was Connell Watkins. The videotape shown of 10-year-old Candace Newmaker's treatment during the Connell Watkins trial are said to look eerily similar to this tape recorded in 1993, where you can see Neil Feinberg using techniques like HT. HT stands for holding therapy, also known as rage reduction therapy. This is where someone forcibly hugs or cuddles a child, often against their will, until they finally relent. It involves some other practices that are, let's say, quite triggering. Take a look.
What happened?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. I gave up. How about I gave up? Steve, this is your life.
Yes.
This is your life. Where are your eyes supposed to be?
Yes.
This is your life. You going to fight for your family? You want to stay in this family or not? Or should we just give up now? What do you want to do? You want to give up? You want to whine and moan?
No.
Well, what is it? Yes or no?
No.
Then say it like you mean it.
No, Neil.
No, Neil, what? Oh, is this the kind of stuff that you do all the time, huh? I forgot. I don't know. Play stupid. Poor little Stevie. Huh? That's the kind of stuff. How'd it go last night for you?
Not good, Neil.
The way it usually goes, right? Because this is the way your life goes. How many times do you think I want to tell you to look in my eyes, huh? How many times do people have to tell you to do things? Oh, I don't know, Neil. How you feeling right now? How'd you feel last night, huh?
Scared.
Scared? Did you act scared? When Mom told you not to come out of your room, what did you do? You're going to go into your whiny, wimpy routine now? Is that what you're going to do? If you don't start dealing with the man inside of you, you're going to kill somebody. Do you understand that?
Yes, Neil.
How often do you think about killing your mother? How often do you think about killing your mother? When I ask you a question, I expect you to respond. Got it?
Got it.
Got it?
Got it.
I didn't like that. Got it. I want it louder and snappier. Got it?
Got it.
How often do you think about killing your mother, Stevie?
Often.
Thank you. So you say that in a full sentence.
I feel I don't like killing your mother often.
What? Do I want mumbling here? Kick. I don't want you to mumble in here.
Yes, Neil.
Got it?
Got it.
Got it?
Got it.
How you feeling right now?
Scared.
Do I want one-word answers in here?
No, Neil.
No. I don't want one-word answers. Got it?
Got it.
How do you feel about me being the boss right now? Do you like other people being the boss of you?
No, Neil.
Say, I hate it.
I hate it.
Is that the truth?
Yes, Neil.
Then you say it like you feel it. I hate other people bossing me.
I hate other people bossing me.
Louder than that.
I hate other people bossing me.
Louder than that.
I hate other people bossing me.
Again.
I hate other people bossing me.
Kick hard. Stop kicking. I want a full sentence. Do you think about killing your mother a lot?
Yes, Neil.
Yes, Neil, what?
Yes, Neil, I do feel like killing my mother.
Do I want mumbling in here? Kick. You say ready, you be ready. Got it?
Got it!
I don't want wimpy kicking either. Kick! How you feel about me making you kick?
Mad? I feel mad, Neil.
Then say it like you feel it. It makes me mad.
It makes me mad!
Show me the mad.
It makes me mad!
I want to see you're mad. You show it to me. How mad are you?
I'm really mad, Neil!
Want to kill me?
Yes!
Then say it. Look at me. Look at me. Say I'd like to kill you, you motherfucker.
I like to kill you, you motherfucker!
In my eyes.
I like to kill you, you motherfucker!
Louder than that.
I like to kill you, you motherfucker!
Again.
I like to kill you, you motherfucker!
Open your eyes and look at me and say it.
I like to kill you, motherfucker!
Again.
I like to kill you, motherfucker!
When I say open your eyes, I mean open them. Got it?
Got it!
How do you feel?
Mad, Neil!
I'd like to kill you, right?
Right!
Say it.
I like to kill you, Neil!
Show me. Show me all the mad inside of you. Look at me. What do you want to call me right now, huh?
I jerk!
Louder than that.
Jerk!
Eyes open.
Jerk!
Again.
Jerk!
Louder than that.
Jerk!
Good. What would you like to do to me right now?
Hit you!
Where?
Anywhere, just so I can hit you!
Then you say it.
I wish I could hit you, Neil!
Again.
I wish I could hit you, Neil!
Eyes open.
I wish I could hit you, Neil!
Good. Again.
I wish I could hit you, Neil!
Because you argue with everybody about everything. Right?
Right!
Because you never accept responsibility for what you do or for what you feel. Right?
Right!
And that's got to change. If you want to go home, that has to change. Got it?
Got it!
So don't make the mistake of arguing with me in here. When I grab your mouth and do this, how do you feel?
Scared!
Well, you yell it at me. You're scaring me.
You're scaring me!
Again.
You're scaring me!
Stop kicking. Are you doing it my way? Are you doing just about everything that I tell you to do? Are you kicking when I tell you to kick? Are you?
Yes, Neil.
Are you stopping when I tell you to stop?
Yes, Neil.
Are you screaming at me louder when I say louder?
Yes, Neil.
Are you doing it my way?
I think so, Neil.
Did you die?
No, Neil.
Do you think you're gonna die? The truth is you do. Don't you?
I guess so, Neil.
So look at me and say, I just want to kill everybody.
I just want to kill everybody!
Again!
I just want to kill everybody!
In my eyes!
I just want to kill everybody!
Louder than that!
I just want to kill everybody!
Again!
I just want to kill everybody!
Again!
I just want to kill everybody!
Alright, kick. I want to know 3 things that Mom did last night to piss you off. Got it?
Got it!
Is this going to take all day?
No, Neil.
Who takes all day to do things?
Me, Neil.
And why is that?
I don't want to do it, Neil.
Good. Say that again.
I don't want to do them, Neil.
I hate doing them.
I hate doing them.
Again.
I hate doing them.
Again.
I hate doing them.
Louder.
I hate doing them.
Again.
I hate doing them.
Again.
I hate doing them.
Now, I'm no psychiatrist, and I'm not saying that Nancy and Beth practice these techniques now, but I know abuse when I see it. Beth, Nancy, I appreciate what you do if you're really helping young children. But if you're using these torture methods on them, you're animals, because I don't see therapy. What I see here is darkness. But surely Nancy Thomas isn't into any of this stuff, right? She's a good person. She helped Beth. Surely her thoughts are much different from Watkins and Neil Feinberg. But are they? In her own words from her bonding and attachment workshop, she says,
"In rage reduction therapy, the person doing the holding is the person in control and he is the aggressor. He holds the child and provokes the child into a rage on purpose. Rage reduction therapy works where no other method has proven effective with unattached children. Traditional therapy, it's a total waste of time."
And here's a quote from the book Dandelion on My Pillow, Butcher Knife Beneath.
CJ, or Canale Watkins, lovingly pulled her over into her arms, smiled and said, "Well, sweetheart, if you have special powers, then just use those special powers to get up." Beth's little body began to writhe. She bit, she pinched, she clawed, she kicked, she hissed, she growled, she spit, she cursed, and then she fought some more.
Nancy also preaches about something called power sitting, where she makes a kid sit on the floor for potentially hours. It's like the naughty step, but on dirty, reused, needle-injected steroids. She says this about power sitting.
If a child says, "I don't know what it was you wanted me to do," I say, "Then you need to sit and think about it. It's no problem. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry. You can take as long as you need to until you remember what it was that I said. I don't take anything from these kids. When they come in my house, I say, sit. They go sit on a chair and I say, excuse me. I have heard that you do not appreciate your home. That includes the furniture. So, you sit on the floor in my house. They sit exactly where I place them, legs folded, eyes front, facing the wall. I am not an entertainment center. I had a little girl the other day who took 10.5 hours. I said, no rush. It was the easiest day. I love it when they take really long. That peanut butter and jelly starts looking real good after 10 hours. If they need to sit the entire week, it doesn't matter, it's just fine. It doesn't hassle me. I kind of like having that sort of little decoration. Some people buy statues. If they sit the whole day, it gives me the day off. They can go to the bathroom as soon as they are finished with the 15 minutes of good sitting. I tell them to pee their pants. I love it when they have to go to the bathroom while they won't sit.
And this is just a drop in the bucket when it comes to Nancy Thomas's thoughts on how to treat a child with attachment issues. There's way more.
I have had instances where a kid is so out of control that they refuse to stay. When that happens, I will sit on the child. I have had to do this with dogs as well, and they are generally more dangerous with their teeth and claws than children. I pick a good book and read while I sit on a child, and that really seems to upset them because they feel that I should be miserable like they are. We have horses that we have the children ride. It's the same movement that a baby gets bouncing up and down. It's also very sexual, and for girls who have been sexualized, we find that we can replace the neighborhood boys with a horse. It's more socially acceptable and less expensive than pregnancy.
I mean, she's kind of starting to lose that hero vibe if you ask me. But that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. There's a link in the description that lists all of Nancy's quoted methods in an effort to bring awareness to the dangers of these unconventional therapies, if you can even call them that. You know, I'm starting to think this all adds up nicely. The therapeutic abuse, the association to Canale Watkins, Beth's 2015 interview, and the phone call that I'm quite sure was Nancy Thomas. These attachment methods seem to be all about gaining control, and I'm not sure it's the right kind. Perhaps Beth is still under Nancy's control. Maybe this is why they took Beth away from Nancy's ranch in the 80s. Maybe this is why John wants nothing to do with the media, and perhaps this is why Beth and Nancy never mentioned John. Maybe the preacher and his wife saw something at that ranch that they just didn't approve of. Who knows? It's all speculation. But analyzing it all doesn't yield pretty findings. I came into this research at a completely different entrance. I totally sided with Nancy Thomas at the time, but now that I've looked into this more, while I definitely believe attachment disorders are very real and crucially need to be dealt with via awareness and real treatment, the attachment therapy practiced in this circle appears to be littered with child abuse. You can call this shit therapy all you want, but Nancy, a child was murdered at the company you worked with, and I haven't seen you condemn it. Furthermore, you're still practicing and preaching a lot of this evil. And that's what it is. I'd love to see the statistics and find out how many kids came through this therapy completely unscathed. This isn't scared straight, it's more like scared submission. If you're promoting and encouraging this shit, then you are an abuser. By your own admissions, Nancy Thomas, you are abusive. You can shove that power-pissing bullshit up your back hole. Maybe this is why Nancy wouldn't return my calls and messages. I'm glad she didn't, because it caused me to dig deeper, and that's how I found this information. Apart from what's in the book, which I've purchased, ordered, and will read and review at some point, what I've just shared is the story of Beth Thomas as we know it. I couldn't get Beth, or Nancy, or John, or the tenants, and Ken passed away years ago. But I still wanted to talk to someone about RAD that actually has qualifications to speak on it, and I found a doctor who was willing to do so. I won't be discussing everything I discussed above with the doctor. I'm going to stick mainly to reactive attachment disorder and Beth's original story. The reason is, as I stated above, I think every parent should know about RAD and other attachment disorders, even though I believe the treatment above is complete bullshit. If you're dealing with attachment issues in your child's life, seek the help of a qualified professional that won't force your kids to shit themselves for a PB&J sandwich. To sum up this part of the video, I want to state very clearly that 6-year-old Beth Thomas was not a psychopath. She was not evil, and she was not a monster. But that doesn't take away from the fact that John was a victim, and it doesn't make the abusive practices of attachment therapy any less deplorable. And I firmly stand my ground on that. Nancy, if you want to have a conversation and counter anything I said, or just set the record straight, you can find me right here. I'm Mr. Black, and this is The Disturbing Truth. The interview is up next.
She's done a lot of good work with you in therapy, with Canal and with Canal and with Canal and with Canal and...
Someone please come to my defense.
The years you made it clear that the sign of Christ was near, so the people couldn't see what Messiah ought to be. So your word contained a plan they just could not understand.
Tell me about the knives. Where did you get them?
From the drawer.
What kind of knives?
Big sharp.
And what do you want to do with those knives?
Kill John and Mommy with them, and Daddy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Das is back on the show on The Disturbing Truth from A Sight for Sore Minds. If you haven't seen his YouTube channel, you simply must check it out. Some of the best, most informative content you can find that deals with the same stuff that we deal with on this channel. And even though Dr. Das and I share different opinions when it comes to releasing individuals that I would call monsters, it doesn't matter. I still think that I can learn a lot from him. His experience is valuable to me. Dr. Das, good to see you again, mate.
Oh man, you give me such a good intro. Thank you.
That was off the top of the dome, by the way. That was just
freestyling.
Freestyling, yeah. I emailed you recently about a girl named Beth Thomas, and that's what we've been talking about today in this video. Pardon me, you may see me sweating today. I've just finished training with my friend Mathers, which most of you know, and I just don't cool down that quick. I'm a big fat guy, so but I'm working on it. But anyway, Beth Thomas, this little girl was incorrectly assumed to be a psychopathic child, but she's not, is she? She suffers from something called RAD, or reactive attachment disorder, and I just thought you were the man to tell me more about that. And
yeah,
please fill me in on how something like this could happen.
Yeah, so obviously really horrific case. So you can't really imagine somebody having a worse start in life, right? So as I'm sure you've talked about in your other videos, mother died when she was 1 year old, father neglected her, barely fed her, physically, sexually abused her, just literally everything that could possibly go wrong in her childhood did. So to answer your question, there's not really such thing as a baby psychopath or a psychopathic baby or even child, because for the simple fact that psychopathy is a personality disorder, and your personality is not fully developed or not fully finished until you're at least an adult. And in fact, I think this is a perfect example of that, the very fact that she did eventually manage to change some of her personality traits. So your typical psychopath is somebody who is aggressive, callous, impulsive, but most importantly, they're really, really manipulative and deceitful. And I think that Beth, especially in her earlier years, would fit into more comfortably into a diagnosis of, as you say, reactive attachment disorder. So there is definitely some overlap, so I can see why some people would make that stake. I suppose the way that I look at reactive attachment disorder is a child who's not yet learnt any kind of emotional maturity. So they've not really understood what love is, what comfort is, because they've never experienced it. So they can present in many different ways. So a psychopath, generally speaking, is roughly the same as another psychopath. You know, they might have some traits to a higher degree and some traits to a lesser degree, but they have roughly the same traits. Whereas RAD, you can have a whole range of traits, and they're quite different and they're quite inconsistent, and it can change over time. So it could be that child is relatively calm and settled, but has no ability to form any kind of connection. So if they're adopted, say, or if there's a caregiver, they're kind of indifferent to that caregiver. Or they can just seem to lack all kinds of warmth or emotion at all. So if you give them a toy, they might be slightly interested in it, but they don't really care. They're not that happy compared to a normal child who's had the ability to internalize normal emotions. And they tend to be kind of indifferent to people around them, other children around them, and adults and caregivers. And they can, like Beth Thomas was, be also very, very aggressive, especially if they were the victim of violence as opposed to being the victim of just neglect. So hopefully that paints a picture of how there's a big overlap with the two completely distinct disorders.
The children in this old film are being videoed as a part of a study that aimed to examine the effects of maternal deprivation on young children. The kids selected for the study are children who had been in a system that saw them going from home to home, making zero positive social connections, never really attaching themselves to anyone or anything. Most of these children have endured a withdrawn life for so long that it dealt severe injury to the child's ability to establish affectionate relationships, sometimes even leaving the innocent kid with deep wounds that may never fully be repaired. After all, how can you repair something that never existed? The lack of stable relationships coupled with constant recurring separation leaves these young lives looping in a state of both rejection and self-induced isolation.
Okay, so in Beth's case, while she shared, these psychopathic traits with, an adult that may be considered psychopathic, you wouldn't consider her psychopathic. But could that, without proper help and care, could that have evolved or devolved? I don't know what way to kind of say it. Could that have turned into an adult that would be psychopathic?
Yeah, absolutely. So it already damaged her to a very significant degree, and we see that by the very fact that even after she was adopted, these behaviors continued. So even though she had, much more supportive, loving parents, she still had these personality traits. So it almost took her a while to unlearn all the horrific abuse that she would have picked up and modeled from her father, and then to relearn what is a normal human reaction, what is a normal human relationship, how do you express warmth, affection, love. So those things, because she was in a more conducive environment, plus the therapy, I think was another big part, she relearnt normal human behavior. That had she continued in such an environment, or other patients that I've certainly seen who've ended up, in the criminal justice system, who have just had a horrific background that didn't relent, that continued to face physical and sexual and emotional abuse. Absolutely, that's the exact conditions that will grow a psychopath.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And would it be safe to say that Beth, at the time, in place of what should have been love, care, empathy, sympathy even, would it be fair to say that in place of those things she learned hate, aggression, violence, really, sexual promiscuity, I guess is how you might characterize it. Is it safe to say that where love and care would have been, those things were replacing it at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So children, especially younger children, they tend to emulate or model the behavior that they see from caregivers, from parents, sometimes to a lesser degree even from siblings. So it's a very well-known fact, completely separate to reactive attachment disorder, completely separate to psychopathy, in fact, completely separate to psychiatric diagnoses. It's just a well-known fact that people who are victims of both physical and sexual abuse, there's not all of them by any means, but there's an increased risk that they commit those behaviors. And part of that is just modeling. So literally a kid does or copies what his mother or father does. And part of it's because they think that is normal. So they think that violence is a normal way of conflict resolution. If somebody's got a different opinion to me, or if I want something different, something to eat, or I want to watch something different on TV, I will do what Dad did to me when he got angry. So he used his fists, so I'll use my fists. And in a similar way, children who go through a lot of sexual abuse, especially prolonged, repeated sexual abuse, tend to become promiscuous, as you say. And that's because it's nothing to do with the morality. It's because they see overt sex as a normal way of showing affection, especially if they suffered it from their parents. They think that's the natural way of how you show somebody that you have feelings for them.
Beth basically couldn't understand why she wasn't allowed to kill her brother and stick pins in the dogs and murder people. It seemed to me at one point that it was almost like this game that Beth was playing to win, she just didn't seem to understand, why can't I do this? Why can't I be? I suppose she didn't know what evil is. And is it evil if it's all she ever knew?
I would argue that it's not evil, especially in the earlier years before she actually was old enough and mature enough to make her own moral guidance and compass. So, we've got kids. I know you've got kids as well. Part of being a parent is setting boundaries, is telling them off. So if your kid's, shouting or throwing food around the cafe, a good parent will tell that kid that that's unacceptable over and over again, and they eventually learn not only their sort of the boundaries of morality, but also the boundaries of acceptable human behavior. It's not acceptable to swear. It's not acceptable to shout. It's not acceptable to throw a tantrum. I'm sure we've all seen parents. I know I certainly have, who are not particularly good at that, and they seem to have these bratty kids.
This little boy was lost at a Chuck E. Cheese in New York. He continuously behaves horribly and no one seems willing to stop him. He spits, he kicks, he roars, he takes, all without fear of consequence. The fact that the adults in this scenario did so little to restrain the kid and take control of the situation is appalling. Just like the fact that someone thought the correct response to this other little boy's shopping cart tantrum was to reward him with candy. Do not make this mistake with your children. It's crucial to their early development.
So it's like an extrapolation of that. She's never been told no. She's never been told that she couldn't push her brother or hit her brother. And in fact, probably witnessed her father do exactly that. So when she's very young, she's incapable of knowing what's right and wrong. It's only roughly around the age of 7 onwards that children even have the concept of good behavior versus bad behavior.
Well, this kind of segues into the reason that I decided to cover this case. I just finished a story about Ricky Neve. I'm sure you've heard of Ricky Neve.
I've heard the name. I don't know many details, I'm afraid.
A very famous case. He was a 6-year-old boy, again, who was found dead. They thought it was the mom, Ruth Neve. She was tried, found innocent, but guilty of heavy neglect and abuse. It turned out to be another teenager in the area that committed the crime. And we're talking about a case that I think was like in 1994. So, they just caught him, they just sentenced him. But what was really interesting about that case was that after I posted the video, I had an interview with Rochelle Neve, which would have been Ricky's little sister. Now, at the time, she would have been like between the ages of 2 or 3. And she claims that she remembers the abuse that was done to her and Ricky and has some very specific traumatic memories that she brought up. Once I posted the interview, I had a lot of people saying, how the hell could she remember something that happened whenever she was 3? And that kind of inspired me to make this video, because I also suffered some child abuse at the hands of a babysitter when I was around 2, and I remember it. So I kind of had to hold back with feeling like, people saying this was a personal attack. And I thought, no, it reminded me of Beth Thomas immediately. And I thought, well, let's just do a video where we talk about this and how it does affect kids.
Children do not fully develop a sense of self until typically around 1.5 or 2 years of age. Having a sense of self, the I, separate from others, gives a place for memory to be organized and develop personal meaning. Kids begin forming explicit childhood memories around the 2-year mark, but the majority are still implicit memories until they're about 7. It's what researchers like Dr. Carol Peterson from Canada's Memorial University of Newfoundland call childhood amnesia. Implicit memories are memories that a child may not recall, but they mold behaviors and have a lifelong effect. Think of this as emotional recollection, but explicit memories, on the other hand, require actual conscious recall.
I know personally that kids can remember things. For me specifically, it was the trauma that I remember. Yes, most certainly kids can remember stuff at 2 and 3. For Beth, she was 1 to 1.5, and then she was going on to draw pictures about what happened to her. So this idea that, she was too young, she couldn't possibly remember that's false, isn't it?
Yeah. So firstly, I'm really sorry to hear what you've been through, Justin. I had no idea. I'm really sorry. To answer your question, yes, absolutely. So I think what people sometimes mix up is that usually children can't form vivid memories, like vivid visual memories, until they're around, usually about 4, sometimes towards the end of 3. But that's what's typical. Everything's on a spectrum. So there are definitely kids that can remember later, and there are kids that can't remember anything from when they're 3 or 4. They can't remember till they were 5 or 6. So that's one thing. The other thing that I would say is that it doesn't have to be a vivid memory that you remember every single detail. You remember emotional. So your emotional memory develops earlier than your actual literal memory. So you can feel feelings. So if you had comforting, happy times when you were 2 or 3 years old, you can remember that, even if you don't remember the exact specific details, or vice versa. And in fact, studies have shown that traumatic memories are encoded deeper than neutral memories. So it absolutely makes sense to me that somebody who went through a traumatic experience could remember something. And it might not be very vivid, but they remember vaguely the feeling of being fearful, of not being loved, of not being supported, of being distressed and not being comforted in that state. So absolutely, I think it's very feasible. And the very fact that you have children who go through, so not even Beth Thomas, but in general, we know that children who are put up for adoption, who are abused at a very young age, 6 months, a year and a half, have behavioral problems. That in itself, to me, proves that there must be some kind of emotional link to what they experience, because otherwise there's no logical reason why they would have behavioral problems compared to other kids who were put up for adoption at the same kind of age.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are two different avenues there. One is trauma affecting you young, which is one thing, but then actually remembering. For me, I do remember. Now I have gaps, but I do remember vividly quite a bit of it. Not the start, not the end, but kind of the events surrounding those 2 days when it happened, I remember. And it was only when I brought, these occurrences up to my mom that she sort of went, holy shit, I know what day you're talking about. And she had went to work that day. She was a pizza girl. She'd went to work, and before she dropped me off at the babysitter's, I think it was the second night that I stayed there, the lady wanted to meet her on the road instead of at the house this time, and sort of exchanged me over between cars. And just as soon as she went to, give me or hand me over to the babysitter, I lost it. And I remember this vividly reaching out, grabbing for my mother, begging for her not to make me go. And I'd never done that before. I was always very, very good with strangers, and it just didn't sit well with my mother. So she went to work, couldn't shake the feeling. So she said to her boss, look, something's not right. I need to take off and go get my son. And the boss said, sure, no problem. And when she came to get me, the lady answered the door. Her name was Lynn. And she said, what are you doing here? My mom went, well, I'm off early. I came to get my son. And the lady said, well, you're not supposed to be here till, 2 a.m. or whatever. And my mom went, well, I'm here now. So, give me my fucking son. And the lady said, well, you can't have him until later. And tried to close the door, but my mom just went mama bear mode and shoved past the woman, grabbed me. I had been laying in a diaper or nappy, as you'd say in the UK, that hadn't been changed, and she just rushed out of the place. And it turned, and there were men in there partying and stuff. And 7 months later, the lady died of an OD, and we don't know who the men were. So I remember quite a bit of this. Some of it my mother told me, but a lot of it I remember quite vividly. So Rochelle Neve had talked about a specific instance where her mother had held Ricky over a bridge, threatening to drop him, and they scared her, or had beaten her, or locked them in a room where there was piss and shit everywhere. Is it possible that we actually remember these things, or have we created some kind of memory based on our trauma?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. As I was saying before, different people have, you got what's typical, and then you've got people that are outliers. So I think it's definitely possible. I suppose it's hard to really know how real the details are, because our brain tends to confabulate, so it tends to fill in gaps which we're not sure about. So, I would say, especially for something that's traumatic or emotional, you're almost the person, the victim, almost certainly remembers the important bits of what actually physically happened with the abuse, and they may or may not remember the surrounding bits particularly well. So they might misremember exactly what the layout of the house was, or exactly the words that were spoken, and they might fill in little gaps. But the thing is, it's really hard to know what is true and what's not unless you have objective evidence. But the most important bit is remembered.
Yeah, and oddly enough, that's exactly how it is for me. I mean, I do remember the layout of the house, but I don't remember the color or where the couch was, or I couldn't walk through it now if I wanted to, and tell you where things were. But as you say, it's those traumatic events. I was made to go down on this babysitter, as a 2-year-old, and then another guy did stuff to me, and there was another guy. But it really is, as you say, it was those traumatic points that I remember. I don't remember much about the lead up. I remember a little about the lead up, but a lot of that is gone. So I suppose when Rochelle says that she remembers specifically her mother holding Ricky over the bridge, it's similar to what I experienced. So And
how old was Ricky at the time?
Ricky would have been 5, I think, 5 or 6. So it was just before he died, Rochelle would have been 3. So, and I was 2.5, I think, and I remember. I remember. There's no doubt about it. My mother didn't bring it up to me. I brought it up to her when I was 11 because I couldn't shake it. And I'd had these nightmares as well, too, that she told me about. I couldn't wake up for them when I was young. Things I didn't even know I experienced. But yeah, it was a crazy conversation that day. Let's say in that situation, I lived with this babysitter, and I was treated like this daily, to the point that I thought this was normal behavior. At what point would the effects become irreversible? At what point would what was happening to me become something sexually that would be encoded in me, like some kind of fetish? Because I've seen it a lot with abuse victims that have maybe not got the treatment and then maybe went on to harm people themselves. They repeat what happened to them often. Like Luis Garavito was a perfect example.
Yeah. So my answer to that, Justin, would be the same as my answer to a lot of psychiatric questions, I'm afraid, which is that it completely depends. It's so variable for different people.
The best available research suggests that 75% or more of those who commit acts of sexual or physical abuse against others were themselves abused as children. However, the research also indicates that the vast majority of children who are sexually abused do not go on to abuse others.
So some people have gone through very horrific abuse and have ended up surprisingly being very sort of emotionally resilient and having quite minimal psychiatric damage, whereas some people have gone through, relatively speaking, low levels of trauma and can be quite damaged. So I'll give you some specific examples for cases that I've seen. So as you know, I do criminal cases, but I also do civil cases, which means where somebody's suing somebody. And there was a man called John Styler, so Jon is his first name, Styler, and he was a Welsh headmaster, and he abused a whole range of young schoolboys in the 1970s. And he got away with it, even though other teachers suspected what was going on, which is a whole different conversation. And he got moved between schools and basically got away with it for years. And then when the allegations surfaced, when the men were older, he committed suicide, so he never got justice. But I was instructed by the solicitor's firm to carry out an assessment on these men. So I assessed quite a few of them. It's probably about 8 or 9 altogether. This was all about maybe 3 years ago now. So I saw them all within the space of a few weeks. And the abuse was very, very similar, like the grooming, the telling them that they were special, and getting them to come to their offices for these special lessons where he actually, abused them, and even the type of the abuse was almost identical. I won't go through it all for your viewers. But what really surprised me, even doing all my training in psychiatry, was that the outcome was very different. So there was at least one person that I can think of, and this was, just to be clear, this was prolonged abuse. This for each individual victim. It wasn't just a one-off incident. It was something that happened for about 2 or 3 years, maybe up to several times per month. So at least one of the victims was relatively unscathed. I would say that I diagnosed him with dysthymia, which is just an unstable low mood, but not quite bad enough to be depression. But he was successful. He had a family of his own. He had a couple of kids. He had quite a high-flying corporate job, was on a very good salary. To all intents and purposes, if you looked at him from the outside, you didn't know what he'd been through. You wouldn't have suspected that anything went on. Having said that, he was the exception. Most of the other cases had some form of anxiety or depression, and some had post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is a key diagnosis related to trauma. In fact, I've seen more cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, far more than I have ever of reactive attachment disorder. I think for a couple of reasons, because reactive attachment disorder is usually diagnosed at a young age and people can grow out of it. So by the time that I see them as adults, it's often either not been caught in the diagnosis or kind of is lost in the medical notes. And also because post-traumatic stress disorder is usually when the event has happened later in life, so people are more likely to remember it clearly. So adolescence, adulthood. So of the men that I assessed, a huge proportion had anxiety, depression. A smaller proportion, but significant, had post-traumatic stress disorder. So I suppose this is a rambling way to answer your question, is that it's so varied. So there will be some people that went through exactly the circumstances you're talking about of Beth Thomas, who probably would be a little bit messed up in childhood, but would be able to, just because their emotional resilience, will probably be able to, I don't know what the term is, snap out of it, grow out of it, relearn their emotions out of it relatively easily, which I think happened to Beth eventually. And there'll be other people who are completely damaged, who will be, could have everything from post-traumatic stress disorder to complex PTSD to suicidality to self-harm to possibly being abusers themselves. There's just such a whole range of spectrum, and it's so unpredictable that you can't say, there's no such thing as a typical case, I would say.
I recently interviewed a famous forensic biologist named Dr. Mark Benecke, German guy, very interesting character. We were talking about Luis Garavito, who had been abused badly as a child and went on to kill and torture and rape 300 to 400 boys, plus hundreds of others that he would have just, picked up in like an area where there would have been a lot of child prostitutes, child trafficking, where he would have just, taken those kids as well. And one thing he mentioned was that once it appears via, current studies, that once something becomes ingrained in someone as a fetish, as they move on into, I guess, maybe it's later teens or early adult, once it gets to that point, there hasn't really been any documented cases where people were able to change that. Now, whatever that is, maybe you have a foot fetish, maybe you're into little kids, but he was under the impression that the given evidence at the moment states that this isn't something that has not that it can't be changed, but that it's never really been seen to be changed.
Yeah. So I'll tell you my thoughts about that. I suppose it's quite hard to measure, because especially if you're talking about, you said little kids, so people that offend against children, you can never really know 100% if they're telling the truth, because it's quite easy for somebody to say, I don't have those thoughts anymore, if they're in prison and they've had this rehabilitation, or even in one of my psychiatric units. So I would broadly agree that the thought process itself is unlikely to change, but that's not the important bit. The important bit is their behavior and whether they act on those impulses. So I remember being asked in an interview quite recently about paedophilia. So the question the interviewer asked was, is paedophilia a mental illness? And my answer was potentially controversial. It depends how, well, first of all, it depends how you define a mental illness, but it's not the fault of the person that has those thoughts, because that is ingrained, that is a fetish, that is something that's come from their that's developed during their puberty and during their adolescence, possibly in relation to abuse that they've suffered. But that's not the important bit. That's not actually what really matters. What matters is whether they act on those behaviors or not. And that absolutely can change. And that can change for a number of reasons. It could be that somebody themselves has an internal epiphany and feels a huge amount of guilt for what they've done before. It could just be the pressure of society, right? So they've already been caught 2 or 3 times. They've been in and out of the prison system, probably been victimized, probably rightly so, some would say, because of the types of nature of their offenses. So they want to turn their lives around, not because they've developed more empathy or because they've looked into the morality of their past behaviors, but because they don't want to keep living their life like that. So it's absolutely possible to change the behavior. And I think that's the important bit more than the fetish.
Possibly. I mean, I guess you have to look at it and you have to ask yourself, is it worth the risk to other people? I mean, this is always where you and I kind of go in separate ways, but it doesn't change the fact that how much I can learn from what you have to say, and it really helps me see things from another side. But yeah, still, I'm of the mindset, and I suppose it's not coming from a medical background. It's coming from someone who's been through it. Abuse specifically, of a mother who has been through it way more than I have, and her sisters. I think even my grandmother. I've seen it a lot. So I'm of the mindset that if you've reoffended twice, meaning you've offended 3 times when it comes to kids, you don't get out. You've proven that you cannot control those thoughts. Now it's different. Say someone who has these thoughts, and they come forward and they go, I have these thoughts. I can't fucking stand it. I want to fix it. I haven't acted on them. I've never downloaded CP or anything like that, but I want to fucking stop this. I need help. Okay, I've got a lot more sympathy for someone like that. That's clearly some kind of sickness or disorder that is beyond their control, but they can control whether or not they go and get help. And
I would agree with pretty much everything you said there. There's one thing that I would add to that. If somebody, and I have met people like this, not very often, but I'd say probably once or twice a year, somebody like this comes across my radar. If somebody offends only during a mental illness, so say if they've got severe bipolar affective disorder and they go into a manic phase, so you might know this, but when you suffer from mania, then you're disinhibited, you're very speeded up, you make very impulsive actions, you can be quite aggressive at times, or your thoughts can be racing, you can come up with lots of ideas and never finish them. So in that context, if they sexually offend, then I would want to treat that. Obviously, it's not just a case of giving them some tablets and saying goodbye to them. That it's far too risky. I would want to follow them up in the community. I'd want to see them on a regular basis. But I suppose what I'm saying is that's another situation for me. I don't know how you feel about this, Justin, where I think that somebody can be given another chance if they've got a mental illness which we can treat.
I suppose the risk that we run there is tarring people with bipolar disorder as potentially having a hood pass to pedophilia if they're in a manic state, and I can't agree with that. But I understand where you're coming from. I definitely understand where you come from, and I'm all for them being treated, just not released. Hung up by their necks. Now,
and just to throw a spanner in the works, I just wanted to see what you think about this. So, again, if we're talking about people who intentionally evil people who have no remorse or don't care about offending against children, then you and I are on the same wavelength. I don't think they should be given second or third chances. What about somebody that's got like a learning disability? So somebody with, say, severe autism who has these sexual urges, who doesn't really understand the impact of their actions. Would you prefer for them to have a comfortable life but always in detention, or do you think somebody like that should be given a chance at living not completely independently but say in supported accommodation, but there's a risk that they could leave their accommodation and do something sexual?
Again, I think we run the risk of tarring people with autism as potential having potential hood passes to pedophilia. I understand a learning difficulty. I think in that situation, I would agree with your first statement that they need to be in a medical institution and comfortable. I mean, this when you go that deep into it, that it's But the question really is does that person understand? Did they know what they were doing was wrong when they did it? And if they didn't, why didn't they? I mean, these are questions that I would have to answer. I personally just can't advocate for letting a offending pedophile back out ever. I just can't. I can't do it no matter what. Even if myself, maybe I got possessed by a demon for real, like honestly got possessed by a demon and went out and did something like that. And they exorcised me and the demon was gone. Lock me up.
I think that pretty much along the lines of what we're saying. I think if somebody's a repeat offender, shows no kind of remorse, shows no willing to change, then I think they're unsafe and they should be locked up. I think most people would agree with that. I think there is a grayer area in people who are less responsible for their actions. So people with mental illnesses, learning disabilities. I just want to make the point that I mentioned people with bipolar and people with autism who've committed these kind of offences. It is extremely rare. It just happens to be that as a forensic psychiatrist, that's exactly the kind of thing that I see, because those are the cases that are referred to me. So I don't want to sort of add to the stigma of mental illness and say that most people, or even a significant proportion of people with those illnesses, would go on to do that kind of offence.
And that's what I agree. That's what I agree with mostly.
Yeah. But I think, in my God, I have literally seen people who have offended with a learning disability because they don't understand what sexuality is, what consent is. They still have these urges. People around them have boyfriends and girlfriends and partners. They want one and they don't know how to do it. So, one man that I wrote about in my book went and sort of groped some random women, but when you spoke to him about it, he didn't understand the impact of his actions. So that's the grey area that's harder to deal with, because, I mean, there's a moral issue of locking somebody up for the rest of their lives, but also there's a resource issue as well. There's only a limited number of hospital places, and if somebody has committed behaviour like that and then has been absolutely fine on the ward or in the care home for, say, 5, 10, 15 years, then will it come to a point where you can say they're safe? And when is that point? It's a very murky kind of grey area.
It really is, and I think you even run an even bigger risk of creating more people who could potentially abuse by letting someone out that shouldn't be, which eats into those resources even more so. I think where we probably could agree is that someone like you've just discussed, or like you've just described, I wouldn't put them to prison. I wouldn't because it's not punishment that they need. It is help. It is. I mean, if you're talking about someone who's got the mentality of a child Beth Thomas's age and really doesn't understand it, and maybe were abused as well, I mean, you're right, there is a gray area there, and they should be treated, but I, under no circumstance, would ever let them out. But that's just me.
Okay, so I think we're like the Charles and Xavier of the debates, aren't we? Charles Xavier and Magneto, we'll politely agree to disagree.
Yeah, totally, yeah. And that's the thing about conversations with you that I really enjoy, is that we can have a conversation, and we can go different ways and different points. But I don't know about you, but I always learn something. It's a pleasure to have you on The Disturbing Truth again. If you don't know, Psych for Sore Eyes, Dr. Das, he's my doctor. I have him on my phone. I text him whenever I can't sleep and I need, verbal cuddles. He's my guy.
Just want to say thank you for having me on. I like talking with you because you ask interesting questions, and you're not, we agree on a lot of things, but not on everything. And I'm always open to hearing other people's points of view, because sometimes, even though sometimes I don't share your opinion, I can completely understand why you would think it. And that's not just with you. I think that's with a lot of people that I have these kind of philosophical conversations with.
It was a pleasure to hear your take on Beth's story. Helped me a lot to understand RAD. It's something I think you'll agree that more parents should know about. It's something that matters. I mean, through discussing this case, as you know, I have a 4-month-old little boy. Through discussing this case, it's even made me more careful about my facial expressions around my baby. I'm smiling every time I see him. I'm giving him love. I'm giving him care. I'm giving him as much as I can,
Crazy to think what the littlest babies can actually pick up just on tone, expression, everything that you've just been talking about.
Yeah, and specifically, a mother's facial expression is so important to a child. I mean, it's way more important than a father's, and a mother's being in the child's life is way more important. Even though, from what I've been told from another professional, is that if you take either one of those structures away, mother or father, the whole thing it just wants to collapse. But by far, a mother it seems to be more important. So little things like that. And that plays into Beth's case as well, because her mother passed away when she was 1, and she was left in the care of just her evil father.
The horrible, horrible man.
Awful. But yes, again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see you. Let's do it again, man.
Okay, let's do it. Thank you, Justin.
Peace out,
all the
brother.
best, sir.
See ya.